3:26 p.m., Clearwater Airport. The sun baked the tarmac as Victoria Hale, the Ice Queen CEO, paced frantically. Her billion-dollar empire was stalled by a grounded jet. Amidst the chaos stood Ethan Cole, a quiet single dad in a grease-stained jacket. To Victoria, he was just another invisible failure. "Who are you supposed to be?" she sneered. "Just ground support," someone whispered. Losing her composure, Victoria whipped the ignition keys at Ethan's chest. "If you think you're so brilliant, fly it." Ethan caught them with a blur of veteran instinct, a movement so fast it was almost invisible, without saying a word. Ethan Cole was 44, a man whose presence was defined by a deliberate, quiet grace that seemed entirely out of place in a grease-stained tool shed. He moved with the economy of motion found only in those who had spent decades mastering high-pressure environments where a second's hesitation meant disaster. He was a single father who had rebuilt his entire existence around his 9-year-old daughter, Mia, after the devastating loss of his wife, Sarah. Sarah had been the anchor of their family, the light in every room, but a chronic heart condition had slowly drained her life away over 3 agonizing years. Her passing had left Ethan with a mountain of medical debt and a heart filled with a silent, heavy grief that he carried like a second skin, hidden beneath his work clothes. To the world at Clearwater Private Airport, he was simply the help, a part-time technician and general laborer who handled the heavy lifting that the white-collar executives didn't even want to acknowledge. He lived a life of total, self-imposed anonymity. He didn't boast about his past, he didn't display his old flight patches, and he never spoke of the harrowing air-to-air combat missions he had once led over hostile territories. Ethan chose this humble path for one specific reason: Mia. He needed a job with zero travel and predictable hours so he could be the one to cook her favorite pasta, help with her complex science projects, and tuck her in every single night with a bedtime story that promised the world was a safe place. He had walked away from a world-class military career to become a ghost in a hangar, preferring the honest, grounding smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid to the high-altitude politics and moral compromises of his previous life. His eyes, once accustomed to scanning the horizon at Mach 2, now found peace in the intricate dance of gears and the steady rhythm of a well-maintained engine. He saw beauty in the precision of a calibrated sensor, a stark contrast to the chaotic, often deceptive world of corporate acquisitions that Victoria Hale inhabited. He looked at the sleek wings of the private jets not as symbols of wealth, but as fragile structures that required absolute truth to stay airborne. To Ethan, the laws of aerodynamics were sacred, a fundamental contract between the pilot and the sky that no amount of corporate branding could override. The airport staff knew him as a man of few words, a reliable pair of hands who always arrived 5 minutes early and never complained about the sweltering heat or the stubborn engine grease. But today the atmosphere on the Clearwater tarmac was thick with more than just the mid-afternoon humidity. It was charged with the electric, jagged tension of corporate desperation. Victoria Hale, the ice queen of the global aerospace industry, was a woman who lived her life in rigid 15-minute increments, and she was currently 30 minutes behind schedule. She was heading to a high-stakes investor summit in Chicago, a meeting that would determine whether Hale Aerospace would receive the massive funding needed to launch their next generation of sustainable engines. To her, every second wasted on the ground was $1 million lost, and she viewed the technical failure of her Gulfstream as a personal insult to her absolute authority. She paced the blistering asphalt in $3,000 heels, her sharp, predatory eyes scanning the technicians, as if she could physically intimidate the machine back into functioning. Ethan was nearby, quietly helping a junior mechanic secure a heavy diagnostic cart that was rattling in the sudden afternoon wind. Victoria's gaze locked onto him, the man in the faded denim and the jacket that had seen better decades. He looked like the physical embodiment of the inefficiency she despised. She saw his calloused hands and the smudge of oil on his cheek, and in her mind, he was just another anonymous cog in a broken machine that was costing her the deal of a lifetime. The pilots and the airport manager stood nearby, their faces flushed with the profound embarrassment of being unable to fix the mysterious electrical glitch that had grounded the flight. The captain, a man with 20 years of commercial experience, had already admitted he couldn't override the safety interlock, yet Victoria refused to accept the reality of the delay. She turned to Ethan, her voice cutting through the hum of the auxiliary power unit like a jagged whip. Why are you just standing there watching like a tourist? Are you part of this collective incompetence? Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He looked at the aircraft's engine intake, then at the specific flickering light on the left wingtip, and finally back at the woman who was projecting her internal panic onto him. He thought of Mia, waiting for him at home to finish her science project about the stars, and he felt the familiar, ironclad promise he made to himself. I stay invisible to stay safe for her. But the sheer, unearned arrogance in Victoria's eyes triggered a dormant memory of a different time. A time when he stood on the salt-sprayed deck of a carrier, responsible for the lives of 100 young men and women. He walked toward her, not out of aggression, but with the calm, steady pace of a man who knew exactly what the wind was doing to the aircraft's balance. The problem isn't the software, Ms. Hale, Ethan said, his voice low and devoid of the trembling deference Victoria was accustomed to. It's the pressure differential in the auxiliary line. You're forcing a system that's currently trying to save you from a catastrophic mid-air fire. Victoria's lip curled in a sneer. She didn't want a technical lesson. She wanted a miracle. And she didn't believe miracles came from men who wore stained work boots. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the digital ignition keys, and tossed them at him with a flick of her wrist. The sun glinted off the metal as it sailed through the air. Ethan's hand moved with a blur of veteran speed, catching the keys mid-flight without even looking at them. If you're so smart, she challenged, her voice rising so everyone on the tarmac could hear her mockery, then fly it yourself. Show us how a ground support genius handles a 10-ton piece of advanced machinery. The ground crew went silent. The junior mechanic held his breath, terrified of the fallout. Victoria expected him to drop the keys or walk away in shame. Instead, Ethan looked at the keys in his palm, then at the massive machine behind him. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked toward the air stairs with a purpose that made the airport manager's heart skip a beat. Victoria let out a short, hollow laugh that sounded more like a bark than a gesture of amusement. 90 seconds? She shouted after him as he climbed the stairs, her voice laced with incredulity. Is that how long it takes for a mechanic to find the on switch in a cockpit he's never even seen? The airport manager started to protest, his face turning a deep shade of crimson, shouting that this was highly irregular and they could not allow an unverified technician into the command seat of a multi-million-dollar Gulfstream. Ethan didn't look back at the chaos brewing on the tarmac. He entered the cabin, moved past the plush Italian leather seats and the crystal glassware, and stepped into the cockpit. The moment he sat in the pilot's seat, the world outside the windshield seemed to vanish. The familiar smell of the high-end avionics and the cold, sterile air of the pressurized cabin brought him back to his true element, a place where rank meant nothing and skill meant everything. His hands moved over the console with the reverence of a surgeon, silencing the blaring alarms with a series of rhythmic taps that spoke of a deep, intuitive connection with the machine. He could feel the aircraft's heartbeat through the control yoke, sensing the minute irregularities that the automated systems were designed to mask but couldn't fix. His hands didn't fumble. They moved with a terrifying, fluid precision, an ingrained muscle memory born from 4,000 hours of high-performance flight time in the world's most dangerous skies. He didn't look for a manual or a guide. He ran through a complex tactical checklist in his head, his fingers dancing across the toggle switches and touchscreens like a master pianist performing a grand concerto. He felt the weight of the airframe, the subtle resistance in the controls, and the hum of the cooling fans. Outside, through the reinforced glass, the technicians stood frozen in place. They realized immediately that this wasn't the tentative movement of a man guessing. This was the confident, rhythmic movement of a man who owned the air. Ethan ignored the primary flight displays and went straight for the hidden diagnostic sub-menus that most commercial pilots didn't even know existed. He felt the subtle vibration of the plane beneath him, listening to the high-pitched whine of the hydraulics, sensing a disharmony that only a veteran combat pilot could detect through the soles of his boots. He found it, a microscopic salt corrosion bridge in the auxiliary pressure sensor, a result of the jet being parked too close to the ocean air for too long during its last maintenance cycle. It was a flaw that the standard computer wouldn't flag as a failure yet, but it would cause the engine to overcompensate during the critical climb phase, leading to a catastrophic surge and potential turbine failure. He leaned out of the cockpit window, looking down at the junior mechanic he had been helping earlier. "Bring me the bypass shim and a grade 4 contact cleaner. Do it now." Victoria stood below, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her voice dripping with the sharp sarcasm she used to dismantle rivals in board meetings. "What? Are you trying to teach my elite, million-dollar pilots how to do their jobs now?" Ethan looked down at her, his expression as cold and immovable as the Arctic mountains he used to fly over. "No, Ms. Hale. I'm trying to make sure your daughter isn't an orphan by sunset." The remark hit Victoria like a physical blow to the chest. She didn't know how he knew she had a daughter, or why did he say something so calm and terrifying, but the overwhelming weight in his voice silenced her instantly. Ethan performed a manual recalibration of the sensor bridge, his eyes locked on the frequency readout until the jagged, angry red line finally smoothed into a steady, rhythmic green. He waited for the system to cycle, watching the digital needles settle into their perfect pre-flight positions. Exactly 70 seconds had passed since he entered the cockpit. He hadn't just checked the plane, he had performed a deep system surgical repair that would have taken a standard hangar crew 5 hours of troubleshooting. He stood up, adjusted his weather jacket, and walked back down the air stairs, his face showing absolutely no sign of triumph or excitement. He reached the bottom of the stairs, walked directly to Victoria, and placed the keys back in her hand, his fingers barely brushing hers. "The aircraft is airworthy," Ethan said, his voice flat and professional. "But I wouldn't recommend taking off at full thrust until you reach cruise altitude. Your primary sensor is still marginally unstable. You'll need to fly it in manual override for the first 10,000 feet to be safe." Victoria looked at the keys, then at the man who had just dismantled her ego in front of her entire staff. "And you expect me to believe a janitor's diagnostic over my own multi-million-dollar computer system?" "I don't expect anything from you, Victoria," Ethan replied, turning to walk back to his tool cart. "I'm just giving you the truth. What she does with it is her business." The entire tarmac remained in a stunned, absolute silence, the only sound being the distant, lonely whistle of the wind through the hangar doors. The chief pilot, Captain Miller, who had been watching Ethan's every move from the doorway with a mixture of suspicion and awe, finally stepped forward. He climbed into the cockpit, his hands trembling slightly as he checked the bypass Ethan had performed. He looked at the diagnostic log and felt a cold, sharp sweat break out on his neck. He came back down the stairs, his face as white as a sheet of paper. He ignored Victoria and looked straight at the airport manager. "He saved us," Miller whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "The sensor would have blown the turbine blade right through the fuselage the moment we hit max torque during the climb. We would have lost the whole plane in under 10 seconds. We wouldn't even have had time to call Mayday. It was a ghost in the system, and he found it." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face, the weight of the near miss hitting her like a massive tidal wave. She looked at her luxury jet, the symbol of her global power, and realized it was almost her coffin. She turned her head, searching for the man in the faded jacket, her voice no longer a sharp snap but a desperate, low whisper. Where did you learn to do that?" Ethan had already picked up his heavy wrench, his back to her, ready to return to his life of anonymity. "In places where a single mistake is the last mistake you ever make, and where there are no CEOs to blame when things go wrong." Meanwhile, the airport's head of security, Marcus, had been quietly running Ethan's biometric data through a restricted terminal in the security office. He stepped out onto the tarmac, holding a tablet that glowed with a high-clearance file marked with a black and gold seal of the Department of Defense. "Ms. Hale," Marcus said, his voice shaking with a new kind of intensity, "you might want to see this. This isn't just ground support. This is Colonel Ethan Ghost Cole. Victoria snatched the tablet, her eyes racing across the glowing screen. 4,000 hours, a distinguished flying cross, multiple commendations for extreme valor. The man was a ghost, a legend in the world of military aviation, a pilot whose safety records and tactical maneuvers were still used as the gold standard for pilot training today. But as she scanned the combat records, she saw something more. The record of a man who had repeatedly risked court-martial to bring his wingman home, a leader who valued human life over tactical objectives. This wasn't just a pilot. This was a man of immense moral fiber, a direct antithesis to the cutthroat corporate culture she had cultivated. But as she scrolled down to the recent history, her heart stopped. The file noted a voluntary retirement 3 years ago following a catastrophic loss of military benefits due to a private sector lobbying push that had reclassified veteran healthcare tiers. Victoria realized with a sickening, visceral jolt that she was the one who had led that lobbying effort. Her efficiency directive had successfully pressured the government to cut redundant veteran support packages to fund new, lucrative aerospace contracts for her own company. That single corporate decision had stripped Ethan of the specialized medical coverage his wife, Sarah, desperately needed during her final, most expensive months of care. It was her pen, her signature on a piece of expensive stationery, that had forced this hero into a life of near poverty and grief. The tarmac felt like it was tilting beneath her feet. The mobile meeting room, the luxury jet, the billion-dollar deal in Chicago. It all seemed like worthless trash in the shadow of the man she had systematically destroyed for the sake of a quarterly profit report. She looked at Ethan, who was now quietly talking to the junior mechanic again, teaching him how to properly tension a bolt with a gentle, patient hand. He wasn't even looking at her. He didn't care about her power because he had seen what real power looked like in the cockpit of a fighter jet. Victoria walked over to him, her steps heavy and uncertain, her heels sinking into the softening asphalt. The Ice Queen had melted into a woman consumed by a guilt she hadn't felt in 20 years. "It was me," she whispered, the words catching painfully in her throat. 3 years ago, the healthcare directive. I was the one who signed it. I'm the reason you're here, aren't I? I'm the reason you lost everything." Victoria Hale did something that none of her board members or competitors had ever seen in the history of her career. She stopped. She stood in front of Ethan, her head bowed low, her expensive designer clothes covered in the dust and oil of the tarmac. "I was wrong," she said, her voice slow and thick with a raw, genuine remorse that couldn't be faked by any PR team. "I saw a worker. I saw a number on a spreadsheet. I didn't see a hero. I didn't see the man I was hurting with my own greed." Ethan didn't accept the apology immediately. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer her a graceful way out of her own shame. He thought of the long, sleepless nights in the sterile hospital, the bill collectors calling while Sarah was trying to rest, and the heartbreaking moment he had to tell Mia they were moving out of their family home. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze piercing through her corporate armor. "An apology doesn't fix a broken life or bring back what's gone, Victoria. You didn't just cut a budget, you cut away the hope of families who had already given everything for this country." "Then what can I do?" she asked, her eyes brimming with tears that she finally no longer wanted to hide. "Fix the system," Ethan said firmly. "Stop treating people like line items. If you want to be a true leader, start caring about the people who build your empire, not just the people who buy it." His words were like a physical blow, leaving the entire executive team standing in the stunned, absolute silence as Ethan turned and walked away, back to the shadows of the hangar where he felt he belonged. Victoria didn't board the plane that day. She canceled her flight and postponed the billion-dollar meeting in Chicago, a move that sent shockwaves through the entire aerospace industry. Instead, she stayed at the airport, sitting on a simple plastic chair in the ground crew's break room. She spent the next 6 hours chatting with the technicians, asking about their schedules, families, and safety protocols they felt were being ignored due to so-called business efficiency. She watched as these men and women worked with a quiet dedication that her boardrooms lacked, realizing that the foundation of her empire was built on the backs of people she had barely deigned to notice. By sunset, She had issued an emergency executive order that she called the Cole Protocol. It was a sweeping mandate that restored all veteran benefits for Hale Aerospace employees and established a multi-million-dollar fund for military families in crisis, funded directly from her own personal bonuses. She personally invited Ethan to serve as the executive consultant for safety and ethics, a role that would give him absolute veto power over any corporate decision that compromised human safety. She knew she needed a man who couldn't be bought, a man who saw the human cost of every profit margin. To Ethan, this wasn't about a fancy title or a high salary. It was about ensuring that no other family would have to endure the silent, agonizing loss that he had faced. Ethan set 3 non-negotiable conditions. He would never work in a high-rise office. Every ground worker would receive a 20% pay increase with full health care, and his schedule would be built entirely around Mia's school hours and activities. Victoria accepted every condition without a second of negotiation. She realized that having the integrity of Ethan Cole on her side was worth more than any stock price fluctuation. News of the ground support hero changed the morale of 10,000 employees overnight. The culture of fear was replaced by a culture of empowerment. A few days later, Mia was invited to the airport for a small ceremony. Victoria knelt down to eye level with her and told her that her father had saved a lot of lives. Mia looked at her dad, wiping grease off his hands, and said simply, "My dad always does the right thing. He says being a hero is just doing your job when no one is watching." The company's motto changed to integrity at every altitude. For the first time in years, the Ice Queen felt like she could breathe again. Ethan wasn't a ghost anymore. He was the conscience of the company, finally going home every night to the daughter who was his true North Star. A few months later, on a crisp, clear autumn afternoon, Ethan was standing on the edge of the runway watching a new prototype take its first flight, a plane designed with the safety features he had insisted upon. Mia sat nearby doing her homework on a tablet, the sound of the engines a comforting hum in the background that spoke of progress and care. "Dad," she called out, looking up with a radiant smile, "are you happy you're a director now?" Ethan walked over and ruffled her hair, a genuine smile on his face. "I'm not a director, Mia. I'm just the guy who makes sure the wheels stay on and the wings stay up. And yeah, I'm very happy." Victoria Hale walked toward them, her pace slower and her expression more relaxed than it had ever been. She didn't check her watch once during the entire walk. She sat down on the bench next to Mia and looked at Ethan with profound respect. "We got the Chicago deal, Ethan, but we got it on our terms. They wanted us to cut the safety budget to increase the dividend, and I told them to find another partner. We're building things that last now, not just things that sell." She felt a strange sense of liberation, realizing that her value was no longer tied to a stock ticker, but to the integrity of the machines her company produced and the well-being of the people who built them. Ethan nodded with a small approving smile. "Good. The air doesn't care about your profit margins, Victoria. It only cares about physics and honesty. If you're honest with the machine, it's honest with you." Victoria looked up at the plane as it circled for a perfect, graceful descent. She realized that her life had been a series of high-altitude flights where she never looked down at the people below. Ethan had forced her to land and see the world as it really is. She saw the faces of the engineers, the sweat of the mechanics, and the quiet pride of a father who just wanted to protect his child. She sent a final internal email to global staff that evening titled, "A Ground-Based Perspective." It contained only one sentence: "We are only as strong as the person we think is the weakest among us." Ethan read the email while tucking Mia into bed, closed the app, and kissed his daughter's forehead. He didn't need a medal. He had his daughter, his integrity, and the knowledge that the sky was a little bit safer for everyone tonight. The narrator's voice closes the story with a final thought. She once mocked the single dad. Fly it. She thought she was challenging a janitor to do a pilot's job, but she was actually challenging a hero to save her soul. And in the end, it was the quiet, unwavering strength of a father that kept the entire sky from falling. If you believe that character matters more than status, leave a respect in the comments and subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories. We share the truths that change lives.